Welcome to the video for chapter 19 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about the imperfect and potential of athematic verbs. The imperfect of athematic verbs is very similar to that of thematic verbs. Both use the augment and both use more or less the same endings. And like present athematic verbs, the imperfect of athematic verbs use the strong stem in the singular and the weak stem in dual and plural. Now, as for the endings, there are two small things that we need to note. In the table here, you see the endings that you should already know from, for example, the imperfects of thematic verbs. And in thematic verbs, what we saw was the thematic vowel, a, always preceding those endings. So, for example, we had ach, at, awa, atam, atam, and so on. In athematic verbs, obviously, we would not expect the thematic vowel to be present. However, in the first singular and the third plural, we do have an a in front of the ending. So we don't just have an ending m and n, but we have in the first singular and an in the third plural. When we look at an example paradigm of an athematic verb in the imperfect, we will see what effects those endings beginning with vowels have. So let's look at hu, which is a class 3 verb, meaning to pour, to sacrifice, and being class 3, hu reduplicates in order to form its stem, and so we have a weak stem ju hu and a strong stem ju ho. The strong stem is used in the singular, which is here shaded, and the weak stem is used in the dual and plural. Now, if we start by looking at the second person forms, we can see adjuhoch in the second singular, which consists of the strong stem juho, preceded by the augment a, and followed by the second singular ending, which is just visarga. So adjuhoch. In the dual, we have the weak stem juhu, preceded by the augment a, and followed by the second dual ending tam, so adjuhutam. And in the plural, we again have the weak stem, juhu, preceded by the augment a, and followed by the second plural ending ta. So strong stem, juho, weak stem, juhu, preceded by the augment and followed by the secondary endings. But when we look at the first person singular, we will see that the strong stem does not appear as juho, but as juhav. And the reason for that is that o, which is originally au, appears as av in front of vowels. If you don't quite remember this anymore, look at the section on complex vowels in chapter 2 of the book. So instead of having a juho we have a juhavam. And a similar change, a similar element of internal sandhi occurs in the third plural as well, where in front of the ending an, the weak stem appears not as juhu, but the u at the end of the stem changes into its semi-vowel equivalent w in front of the an, and so we do not have a juhu an, but a juhwan. So the paradigm as a whole is ajuhavam, ajuhoch, ajuhot, ajuhuwa, ajuhutam, ajuhutam, ajuhuma, ajuhuta, ajuhwan. We also get some more internal sandhi. Specifically, in verbs whose stem ends in a consonant, the second and third singular forms will possibly look identical. Let's skip down to the examples for a second. Han, class 2, to kill, should theoretically have a second singular form ahanch and a third singular ahant, consisting of the augment a, the stem han, and the second singular ending visarga ch, or third singular ending t, respectively. So ahanch and ahant. However, if you remember from chapter 14, if you have more than one consonant at the end of a Sanskrit word, so if you have a consonant cluster in word final position, then this final consonant cluster is simplified, and simplification means that all but the first consonant in this cluster are dropped. So instead of ahanch, where we have two consonants at the end of the word, n and visarga, and instead of ahant, where we have n and t at the end of the word, we simply get ahan. The visarga and the t are dropped. So ahan is second singular and third singular. The same happens with wid, meaning to know, also class 2. The second singular should theoretically be awed, and the third singular awedte. But again, consonant clusters at the end of Sanskrit words are simplified by dropping all but the first consonant. So we would theoretically have awed in both cases. Then through external sandhi, awed changes into await. And sometimes you find these two forms looking identical. Sometimes you find await being replaced by awech, which at least looks a little more like a second singular form ending in a visarga. Instead of memorizing a list of forms like this, forms that are not that frequent, you should simply remember that difficult to recognize athematic imperfects are likely second or third singular, and then look at them in the context of whatever sentence you have found them in and try to figure out from the context what the form you are looking at most likely is. On to the potential then. In thematic verbs, we saw the potential marker e at the end of the stem. So, for example, second singular barech, third singular paret, and so on. In athematic verbs, we find the potential marker ya instead, and this ya is added to the weak stem. Again, we have the same endings in the potential as we have in the imperfect, and so what we find added to the stem is yam, yach, yat, and so on. But note that in the third plural, the ending is yuch. So, for example, in class 2 of the verb I, eti, to go, we have iyam, iyach, iyat, third plural, iyuch. Class 3, hu, to pour or to sacrifice, juhu, yam, juhu, yach, juhu, yat, third plural, juhu, yuch, and so on. The potential of athematic verbs is fairly straightforward. If you would like to see a full list of all the forms, please go to the reference grammar at the end of the book. What now remains to be looked at is a number of noteworthy paradigms, and these paradigms are noteworthy either because they have irregular forms or because they have forms that may be perfectly regular but nevertheless are rather difficult to recognize. First among these is the verb as, which is class 2, meaning to be. In the present, we have the strong stem as and the weak stem s. Remember, the guna vowel a is present in the strong forms, and therefore we have as, but it's absent in the weak forms, and therefore we just have s. In the singular, we thus get the forms asmi, asi, asti. Note that in the second singular, we don't have as-si with the stem as and the ending si, but simply a-si with one s. Then in the dual and plural, we have simply the stem s followed by our endings, and therefore we get swach, stach, stach, smach, sta, santi. Next, in the imperfect, we have the stem as throughout, consisting of the augment a and our stem as. We might expect this stem to be as in the strong forms and as in the weak forms in dual and plural, but it's as throughout. Also, in the imperfect, we need to note that the second and third singular forms are asich and asit. So we have the stem as, we have the endings visarga and t for the second and third singular respectively, and in between those we have appearing this long e. So we have asam, asich, asit, aswa, astam, astam, and then in the plural asma, asta, and asan. Finally, in the potential, we have the weak stem throughout, as expected. However, this regular form makes the potential paradigm rather difficult to recognize, because what we get is siam, siach, siat, siawa, siatam, siatam, siama, siata, siuch, where the only element of the stem is just this s. The rest is all ending, and this makes these forms slightly difficult to recognize. Coming up next is I, which is also class 2 and which means to go. And this verb has the same stem throughout the imperfect, and that stem is I. Now I is the augment plus the stem. So instead of E, we have I. But remember, I is a complex vowel that originally was I. Again, on complex vowels, go back to chapter 2 of the book. This original I changes into I before consonants, but in front of vowels, which is what we have in the first singular and the third plural, the I changes into ay. So the second element, the I, changes into a y in front of another vowel, and the a remains long. So we have I before consonants and ay before vowels, giving us the paradigm ayam, aich, ait, aiwa, aitam, aitam, aima, aita, ayan. Next up, we have another class 2 verb, namely han, to kill, which has a number of formal peculiarities. First of all, we find the strong stem, the guna stem, not just in the singular, but also in all the other first persons. So han, which is the stem in guna, appears in the singular in the present, han, mi, han, si, hanti. Han, si is just han, si, but with internal sandhi. Then in the first dual, han, wach, and in the first plural, han, mach. And then in the imperfect, again throughout the singular, ahannam, ahan, ahan. And in the first dual, ahanwa, and in the first plural, ahanma. The second peculiarity concerns two forms that we just heard, namely second and third singular imperfect, ahan. What we have here is once again the simplification of word final consonant clusters. We might expect the second singular to be ahanch and the third singular ahant. But those forms would end in more than one consonant, and whenever that happens, Sanskrit drops all except for the first consonant in that cluster. So both the visarga in the second singular and the t in the third singular drop, leaving us in both cases with the form ahan. Finally, the forms containing the weak root, so the white fields in this table. The weak root of han, one could expect to be hun. Han has a guna vowel, a. In order to get to the zero grade of the root, we drop the guna vowel a, leaving us with hun. Hun, however, never appears as hun. Rather, in front of endings that begin with consonants, it appears as ha. And the reason for that was introduced in chapter 7 of the book. Whenever a nasal, in this case n, stands between two consonants, it does not remain as a nasal, but it changes into a. So instead of in the second and third dual hun tach and hun tach, we get ha tach and ha tach. Same thing happens in the second plural, ha ta. And exactly the same thing again in the imperfect, second dual ahatam, third dual ahatam, second plural ahata. In the third person plural forms, on the other hand, where we have the weak stem not in front of a consonant but in front of a vowel, namely in the present in front of the ending anti, and in the imperfect in front of the ending an, the hun does not appear as ha, but it appears as gn. And so we get the third plural gnanti in the present and aknan in the imperfect. There are historical reasons for this concerning the development of certain sounds in Sanskrit, or specifically the development of g to h in Sanskrit, but unfortunately we can't go into that in more detail right here. Up next is brew, another class 2 verb meaning to speak. In brew we have the strong stem in the singular, the weak stem in the dual and plural. And in the strong forms, so in the singular forms, we furthermore have an E appearing after the stem and in front of the ending, everywhere except for the first singular of the imperfect. So we have brawimi, brawishi, brawiti. Now brav is the pre-vocalic form of bro, which would be the strong, the guna form of brew. And in front of a vowel, bro appears as brav, so brawimi, brawishi, brawiti. In the imperfect, abrawam, abrawich, abrawit. So we don't get the E in the first singular, where we have the ending am. And in front of that ending which also begins with a vowel, we don't have the strong stem bro, but the pre-vocalic equivalent brav, so abravam, and then abrawich, abrawid. The weak stem is simply bru, and so, for example, in the present tense, in the dual, we have bru wach, bru tach, in the plural, bru mach, bru ta. And then in front of the ending anti, which begins with a vowel, the weak stem appears not as bru with a long u, but as bruv, so short u and w, bruwanti. And that same internal sandhi of the stem we also find in the third plural of the imperfect. Again, weak stem in front of an ending that begins with a vowel, so there we get abruwan. Let's move on to two class 3 verbs, namely da, to give, and dha, to put or to place. Now these are class 3, and so to form their stem, they reduplicate, giving us dada and dadha. Remember, aspirated consonants reduplicate without their aspiration, and so it's not da-da, but da-da. Now, that gives us the strong forms singular dadami, dadasi, dadati, and dadhami, dadhasi, dadhati, respectively. The weak stem drops the final a completely, so we have da-d and da-d left. Let's look at the forms of da first. In the dual and plural, we have the first person forms dad wach and dad mach. So da reduplicative syllable, d what's left of the stem, and our endings wach and mach. And then in the rest of the dual, we have dat tach and dat tach. So what happened here is that in front of endings that begin with voiceless t and t, the voiced d at the end of the stem simply also loses its voice. So instead of dad tach and dad tach, we have dat tach and dat tach. The same thing happens in the second plural. So in front of the ending ta, which begins with unvoiced t, we have the d again changing into a t, so we have dat ta. And then in the third plural, we have the form dadati, because in class 3 verbs, the third person plural always has the ending ati, not anti, and so we have da, which is the reduplicative syllable, d, the weak form of the stem, and ati, the ending for the third plural, which looks very much like a third person singular form, so don't be confused by that. Now moving on to dha, we have again our singular dadhami, dadhasi, dadhati, and then the weak form dadh in the dual and plural, giving us first dual dadwach and first plural dadmach. But then in the second and third dual and in the second plural, we again get internal sandhi. We might expect buddha sandhi because we here have a voiced aspirated sound being followed by a t, and normally we would expect the t to become voiced and aspirated, and the voiced and aspirated sound losing its aspiration. If you've forgotten how that works, this is all explained in chapter 8. But to cut a long story short, we do not get buddha sandhi. Instead, the d loses both its voice and its aspiration and therefore changes into t. And then, as a further snag, the reduplicative d, so the d at the beginning of the reduplicative syllable, actually becomes aspirated. So instead of d, we have dh. So we have a second dual dhat-tach, a third dual dhat-tach, and a second plural dhat-ta, with the reduplicative syllable aspirated, dh, and the dh at the end of the stem having lost both its voice and its aspiration, and therefore having changed to d. There is a reason for the change from d to dh in the reduplicative syllable. This reason has to do with historical developments in Sanskrit, and unfortunately we won't have time to go into that here. On to kur, which is a class 8 verb meaning to make or to do. Now, class 8 verbs form their stems by adding the suffix o in the strong forms and u in the weak forms. O is guna, u is 0 grade. And kur does that. However, in kur, we also find a strong form and a weak form of the root kur itself. So we get vowel gradation, strong and weak forms of both the root and the suffix, giving us the strong stem karo and the weak stem kuru. This kuru changes into kurb before vowels, so the u changes into its semi-vowel equivalent w in front of another vowel, and the u actually drops out entirely before w and m, so in the first dual and plural forms, giving us the following paradigms. In the present, karomi, karosi, through sandhi, karoshi, third singular karoti. Then first dual kurwach with the weak stem kuru and the u dropping out in front of the wach, so not kuruwach but kurwach. Then going on kuru tach. First plural kurmach, again not kurumach but kurmach. Then kuru ta, and not kuru but kurv in front of a vowel, giving us the third plural kurwanti. In the imperfect, we have the strong stem karo throughout the singular, but given that the first singular ending begins with a vowel, so the ending is we have not karo but the pre-vocalic form, namely karav, so we have a karavam, a karoch, a karot. Then in the dual akurwa, again with the u at the end of the weak stem dropping out, akurwa, akurutam, akurutam, and the plural akurma, again with the u at the end of the weak stem dropping out, so akurma, akuruta, and then a third person plural akurwan, where again in front of an ending beginning with a vowel, the u at the end of the weak stem kuru appears as kurv, so akurwan. We are almost done now, just a few more brief notes on various verbs. Now stu, which is class 2 and means to praise, has strong forms and weak forms as expected, but the strong forms do not stand in guna, but they stand in vritti. So the singular of stu would be staumi, staushi, stauti, not stomi, stoshi, stoti as we might expect. The weak forms are regular. Note that in the third plural, we don't get stu plus anti, stwanti, but instead we get stuwanti, which simply is easier to pronounce. Then, in all class 2 verbs whose stem ends in an a, there is no stem gradation. We keep the stem ending in a throughout the paradigm. And so, for example, of ya, to go, we have a third singular yati and a third plural yanti. Theoretically, this is irregular, but it actually makes the forms more easily recognizable. Then, swap, which is also class 2 and which means to sleep, also has the strong stem throughout the paradigm. So we have a third singular swapiti and a third plural swapanti. So swap, strong stem throughout the paradigm. Also note, swapiti adds an i between the stem, swap, and the ending, t, and this is something that this verb does in all the endings or before all the endings that begin with a consonant. Finally, some noteworthy sandhi. Watch, to speak, has a singular wag, mi, wak, shi, wak, ti. So in front of consonants, ch appears as its velar counterpart. In front of a voiced consonant, it appears as velar voiced g. In front of unvoiced consonants, it appears as velar unvoiced k, and so we get wag, mi, wak, shi, wak, ti. And finally, dwish, to hate, has a singular dwesh, mi, dwek, shi, dwesh, ti. So in front of the si, that is the ending for the second singular, the sh actually changes into a k, and that k then causes ruki, so we have dwek shi, not dwek si. And in the third singular, the sh, which is a retroflex sound, makes the t, the dental of the third person singular ending t, also retroflex, and therefore we get dwesh ti. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.com. sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!